Hello friends, welcome back to the channel. Today's video is going to be a world building video, and it's one of my favorite subjects, fashion and clothing. I have always been fascinated with fashion history, and not just for the design elements, although that is quite fun, of course, but also what clothes say about a culture and the visual language of fashion. So when you're coming up with a fantasy world and you're thinking about what people are going to wear, it depends on what kind of story that you're trying to write. For some stories, just going with your basic fantasy world garb is fine. Maybe you don't want to distract from other elements of the story, but it offers great opportunity to say something about different cultures in your world. So when you look at how people dress throughout history and around the world, there are a few factors that contribute to it. One, of course, is what textiles and materials are available in the region or through trade. You can't make clothes without the materials to make them. You could also ponder who is responsible for making the clothes and what methods are available, and if any techniques are a local specialty, like knitting sweaters or a local kind of textile, beautiful embroidery, certain dyeing techniques. And then you have your practical considerations. What is the weather like there? What are the people doing in these clothes? If a large part of the society is laboring peasants, then the clothing is going to be more practical than if you're writing about a royal court. And then of course you have the really fun part. What is the language of clothing? What does it mean to wear certain outfits? And how do people use clothing to convey their place in the world, their status, etc.? Sometimes there are also laws or taboos against wearing certain things. Textiles can also have a big effect on the economy of a place. So if you need some manner of desirable goods to fuel a war or a trade agreement between nations, that's one you could consider if you need to throw that in for a world building detail. Everything in a world is interconnected, and clothing has always had plenty to do with the economy, with the politics, with cultural revolutions, and it's a really cool way to make your world feel richer if you throw in a few of those little things. Even if it's just one little line in the book, those are the kind of things that really enhance world building. In this video, I'm going to go over some of the different fashions in my fantasy world and talk about what they mean for the people who wear them, and I'm going to be sketching them out. Hopefully I can get a better angle than the last sketching video where I kept putting my head in the way. So yeah, let's sketch and chat about fashion. My name is Lydia Foxglove, and I am a fantasy author. I've been making my living as a writer for 15 years, and I've been writing in the same fantasy world for 30 years, although most of the books I have published are more like right-to-market romance. But currently I am very focused on the fantasy world that I've spent so much time on, and I love world building, so let's get into it. So my fantasy world, as many of you know, has three main races. One is the Mirim, who are telepathic. They're a little more like elven. And the other are the Darons, who do not have telepathic powers. They have to rely entirely on sorcery. And they also tend to be like more patriarchal, and they also have created the third race, which is the Finarlum. They are created beings kind of like doll people, and they are enslaved by the Darmons. So this is like your basic Darmon man outfit. They cover a pretty wide region, so, you know, I could spend quite a while just drawing their clothes, which is true of a lot of things in this video. But here's kind of your basic Darmon outfit. It's pretty simple. I'd say I was probably kind of influenced by like the clothing of China, but I don't know how much I really thought about it consciously. It was just like an accident from being an anime fan, video game playing and such, that style kind of worked its way in. Even though they are a very patriarchal culture, like none of my people have like, you know, the women don't have a lot of like resplendent gowns or anything. Their clothing is a little more similar to each other in most parts of the world than it has been in some Western dress. I don't honestly know if there's like a particular, you know, cultural reason why women in the West always wear dresses for so long while men were wearing pants. But I think subconsciously I assumed it had something to do with like access to being able to pee. And since they do have like elemental sorcery, there's a little more availability of like decent toilets. So it's a little easier for a woman to slip off and, you know, slide down her trousers. So they tend to wear a little bit like, both of them wear kind of like a long tunic with some kind of trousers or, you know, maybe just stockings for some of the women underneath. And this is like, you know, basic working person's dress. If you were like wealthy merchants at a party, you know, you would not be dressing like this. You would definitely have like very fine robes and probably more embroidery and decoration. One of the more indulgent things that like you would do to show off like a little bit of like you're not dead broke is wearing like boots or like these gaiters with lots of teeny tiny buttons to undo, because that kind of is like a light flex that you have time to do and undo a bunch of teeny tiny buttons. So those have kind of been in style for a long time. And both men and women tend to have long hair. One of the styles that's popular for like wealthier men is to put their hair in like a loop in the back of their head. This is a style that takes, you know, you're not going to be wearing this while you're working hard. So that has a certain element of you're a little wealthier and can do your hair up with like a wire and some kind of, I don't know, they must have something, some kind of hairspray or something. I don't know quite what product they're using there, but they might have just some kind of like potion you can put in your hair to keep it to stay there. So this would be a little bit more of like a wealthier merchant clothing with little, you know, tall boots with little buttons, little pointy toes, your looped braid, little hair ornaments, a collar with like a more of a stand-up starched pointy situation. All those things kind of say you've got some money. You're a little more of a stylish fellow. And one thing about my world, the concept of my fantasy world is that it's like a high fantasy world that used to have like a portal that went into our world in ancient times. They do a little bit of trading and then they lost track of the portal. And then they rediscovered the portal in the 1880s and started importing technology and culture from our world. So then you start to, by, you know, particularly in like the 1910s, you're really starting to see the influence of like American and European dress on their clothing. So this sketch is kind of like what you would see in the Daron capital on some of the girls. A dress that obviously has some influence from like Victorian and Edwardian clothing. They're generally still not like adopting the gowns. The silhouette is a little still more like their robe style in a lot of cases and isn't as long. The skirts aren't as full, but there are a lot of these like knee length or slightly below knee skirts with maybe a little petticoat underneath, some stockings, and some tall boots. And then at parties, you're really starting to see gowns appear there, particularly on the ladies. The men were not quite as quick to adopt Western fashion because it was a little more of a jump for them to go from more colorful and varied longer tunics and, you know, robes and long coats and things into like a suit and tie. Although eventually you do start to see suits and ties too, mixed in with their more traditional clothing. But the women start wearing like your 1910s style gowns with like the high waist and a slim skirt. My favorite fashion designer of all time is Paul Poiret, the French designer, who was really known for this like art deco kind of 1910s, very artistic clothing. Some years ago, I happened to be in New York City by pure coincidence when they had an exhibit of Paul Poiret's clothes at the Met Costume Institute. And man, I tell you, it was just the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The clothes were so magnificent in person. So this is not like a spectacular representation of potpourri style fashion, although I imagine that you might see it there now and then because I feel like it would vibe well with the styles that were already in existence. I seem to have lost the footage of me drawing it, but then we have the clothing of the Hanari Mirim. Now, the Mirim are generally the antagonists of the Darmons. Like, those two groups are kind of at odds. But the Hanari allied themselves with the Darmons instead of their own people. They've always kind of, played by their own rules. And the Hanari still dress more like people would have dressed 200, 300 years ago. Everybody else kind of moved from less fussy styles onto more simple practical clothing, particularly in the courts. But the Hanari stuck with this more old school style. The Hanari are particularly known for using shape-shifting to alter themselves and to having some very impractical clothing. In fact, they revel in how impractical they look. One thing I've always found really fascinating with historical fashion is that people will choose willfully to be uncomfortable and impractical and barely be able to move. Hanari are the epitome of this because they're very good at telepathy. They really focus on training their kids to be really as strong of telepaths as they can be. And that is the skill that they sell to the Darmons, and they make a ton of money doing it. And as a result, almost everyone is wearing long robes that trail on the floor because their floors are always impeccably clean. They have their hair very long, trailing on the ground along with their clothing. Their sleeves, layers of clothing that just trail everywhere. And then they shapeshift themselves to have very narrow waists and very narrow, long feet. And they shapeshift their faces so that they all kind of look the same. But, you have a broad cultural mix with the Darmons, too. Like, you got the river folk, the river traders, and they're very just like working people who don't follow really any of the usual Darmon cultural things. They're all just kind of dressed in this really casual way. If you're an anime fan and when there's like that one character that has like the Osaka accent and they're like a little rough around the edges, I imagine the river traders, they're kind of that person. I think of them as like the working class, mid-Atlantic types, the Jerseyers or something. They're whatever your kind of more a little rough and ready cultural touchstone is. That's your river traders. And if I thought about it a little more, it might be fun actually to give them like a certain garment or silhouette that's unique to them. Like if you study fashion, you'll sometimes see this thing of like, oh, all the boatmen wear this hat or something like that. I guess you get kind of that identity thing, or like, here's the jacket with the certain textile. I enjoy that kind of thing. I haven't given the river traders like a signature piece of clothing, but maybe when I write about Kessely, who's my main like river trader girl character, and I dig into them a little more, I might give them a little something. Then you have the people from the Cowlsons, which is the region on the southern continent, and they are known for really magnificent textiles and dyeing and pattern techniques. So their clothing has just an abundance of fabrics. They like to show off, and I'm not coloring anything because I'm not great at it, but they would have these really, like the Darmons generally are a little more subdued, the ones that I'm normally writing about, but the Chalconian Darmons, they're kind of doing their own thing, and they're a lot more colorful. So this would be like your royal court dress, which would mainly be showing off an abundance of these beautiful textiles that would have like at least one layer would probably have a really great pattern of some kind, so that you didn't totally overwhelm it. You might have some more subdued colors or plain fabrics alongside of it. So I've drawn some clothes from the Darmon contingent. Then moving on to the Mirim, You have the people of Dry, the Dragon Kingdom, which they are Mirim, but they're somewhat isolated from the other Mirim due to a mountain range, and their closest trade city is actually a Daron city. So they do have a little bit of the Daron influence in their clothing, or maybe vice versa. I'm not really sure who pulled from who. But they have kind of some similar stuff with like the hair ornaments at the sides of their head. In fact, really, I suspect that the Darmons grabbed the hair ornaments from the Dragon Kingdom, not the other way around. And they also kind of have your robe. It's kind of cold there, so they generally have like thicker robes and multiple layers. The women always have like a broad sash, which if would be beautifully embroidered or have some kind of, beautiful printed textile, and would be, if you want to be fashionable, you would have that sash tied as tightly as possible to give you somewhat of a good figure, especially since your clothes are kind of bulky in the cold. But you probably have some nice warm stockings underneath your delicate little slippers through most of the year, because this kingdom's at a pretty high elevation and it's fairly far to the north, so the cold is definitely an issue there. They also have a lot of ornamentation with dragon scale. Then your regular Mirim. The Mirim have a little bit more of a European fashion, which I guess is some of the places in the story correlate to, mythical lands that are spoken of in our world, since that's kind of the idea of the book, is that they've had this connection to our world loosely over the millennia. So like the Mirim have Avalon. It doesn't exactly make real practical sense, but you got to pull your inspirations from somewhere. It's hard to make up clothes that just feel completely unique, and especially to describe them in a book. So anyway, they're a little more European. The Darmons are a little more Asian. That's just a loose guideline. So the Mirim would often have just like a little dress with a pinafore, an apron, just kind of a nice, comfortable little dress, stockings and boots. If you were an older woman, you might wear your skirts longer. Like the priestesses of Avalon all have like a dress that goes down to the floor. And then your Mirim man, not that far off from Daron clothing, but just a little more of a Western influence in the style. More jackets and like shirts and pants. Just be like your basic, comfortable, everyday clothing. And by the time that the story gets later, the books I'm writing about now are taking place in like the 1910s, 1920s, where they're not getting a ton of influence from our world yet, except in the Daron capital. But as the story goes through the decades, they're taking more and more culture from our world, like with the spread of media. So by that time, when you get later in the story, it really says something about a character, whether they're still dressing like this and like traditional Mirim silhouette or Daron silhouette with like more of like a tunic or a longer jacket, tall boots, and things people would have worn before the influx of earth culture, versus people who are wearing like a suit and tie or a t-shirt and jeans. I have certain characters that never wear like earth influenced clothing, and then there's some that like never wear traditional clothing, and that can really say a lot about a character, which is also true in our world. Like when you're reading like a historical novel, for example, and there's like that old woman who's still wearing the dresses that she's had since like the 1810s, and this story takes place in the 1840s or whatever, it says something about a character, whether they're updating their fashion. And likewise, when you have like Western culture intrude on other cultures in our world, some people will resist that change and others will embrace it wholeheartedly. So that's an interesting way to convey a character, what they value, whether they're more of a traditionalist or whether they're interested in modern ways. So then, just as you have the Hanari Mirim that are allied with the Darmons, you have the Vendiri Daramon. You don't have to remember all this, by the way. There will not be a quiz. The The Vendiri Daramons live in the Mirim territory and are perfectly friendly with them. And I think of them as a whole culture of Goths. Why? Well, that was kind of how my world started, with me being into Nightmare Before Christmas and like other gothy stuff. So I had a lot of these types of characters, and they just stayed in the story, and they were a lot of fun. So I kept developing them. And they generally dress in like almost all black. A more old-fashioned way for them to dress looks a little more like Renaissance-y, with like a short jacket and little white lace sleeve. And then when you get into more of the modern fashion, the jacket's cut a little longer. They have a lot of like moving sleeves and hemlines in the Vendiri fashion world because they always wear black. So that's never going to change. So if they want to update their fashions over time and show off some new thing, it's always about the silhouettes changing. So you got to have some good, a good cloak, shoulder capes. They should shamelessly look like they just walked out of a Gothic novel, and I don't care if it makes sense. And the Vendiri are a pretty welcoming crew. Like, if you want to become a Vendiri, generally they're going to expect that you will attend their temple and make somewhat of a show of worshiping their gods, although they're not like that strict about it. There's not a lot of like religious rules you need to follow or anything. They just like you to show up because that's part of the community. And then you gotta wear black. If you're gonna be a Vendiri, you gotta wear black. Everybody wears eyeliner, and the men usually wear earrings. A note about eyeliner and earrings is that pretty much all Daramon men, at least like the more fashionable or wealthy ones, wear eyeliner and earrings. In fact, wearing eyeliner and earrings is taboo for Daramon women. It's considered like power fashion. And the entire reason for that was because I was really inspired by the art of Yoshitaka Amano. One of my first big influences was Final Fantasy, and Amano draws a lot of people wearing eyeliner and earrings. When I was like 12, I was like, that's cool. So I drew a lot of men wearing eyeliner and earrings. And then over time, I just liked it because it felt a little like a fun way to point out that how arbitrary fashion is, that we now consider like pink a girl color, whereas pink used to be a masculine color. Men used to be a lot more foppish in the West. All of these things are just completely arbitrary, and there's not really any clothing that really is specific to one gender or the other in nature. It's just whatever we decide at the moment reads as man or woman. So it was kind of fun to play with that and have it in this world. Eyeliner is something that makes men look powerful, and so women are not supposed to wear it. Of course, as the culture changes, a lot of women start wearing eyeliner just to, break with gender norms. And then you have the Vendiri lady. This is the current fashion for the Vendiri lady. She's got a short cape, and she's all covered up, but her clothing has some rather suggestive little cuts. That little dip in the front of the skirt is considered rather alluring, rather suggestive, scandalous even. It's the kind of thing where the daughter shows up wearing it and the mom is like, you need to put some kind of sash over that. But they're dressed very modestly. They even wear gloves. You can't actually see anything, which is another interesting thing about fashion, is what we consider sexual evolves wildly over time, and what is tame in one era could be extremely suggestive in another era. I thought I would draw Lord Daron in his prime. He is the leader of the Daramons, at least the main Daramons I'm writing about. And this is kind of showing like, here is the ideal for a Daramon man for a long time before the influence of Western culture comes along. He's got eyeliner, earrings. He always wears these black wings, which, are supposed to be kind of intimidating. This is like your sorcerer fashion. This dude looks like a sorcerer. And, you know, they don't need to... In this world, the most powerful person is always your powerful sorcerer or telepath. So that has really influenced the appearance of everything, because, like, the most powerful person is not physical. They're not a warrior. I mean, they have those, but the most powerful fashion is not like this burly man with muscles. It is a guy who looks like he knows his magic shit. And that is the epitome of Lord Daron. Then later in the story, one of the most powerful men in the world is Det, who is a half Mirim, half Daron, very powerful telepath, but his rise to power comes along in the 1960s, if we go by our timeline. And at that point, the image of what a powerful man looks like has shifted considerably and taken on more Western characteristics. So Det generally wears a necktie and like a button-up shirt and suspenders, because that was the fashion that came along in like the 1930s, 1940s. And he pretty much wears it forever. But he's still got the eyeliner and earrings. That's just the signature Det look. Is sort of that mix of the old and the new. And in one of my videos I mentioned how, like, he ended up looking like David Bowie before I knew who David Bowie was, which is one of those funny things. Like, I didn't know who David Bowie was, or that he had, like, there was this pale guy with like an eyeliner, suspenders, necktie period. But David Bowie totally did have the Det look going in like the mid 70s, and that is also the Det look. It is pure coincidence, but over time I leaned into it even more because, like, why not? It just seemed like fate. So there's the old and the new as far as the most powerful man in the world. And because I've been studying fashion my entire life, I have pulled influences from so many different cultures and time periods. It's all kind of just a big database in my brain. But I really like it when the clothes say a little something about the people who wear them. I could probably talk about this topic and like the minutiae of clothing and culture for hours, but I hope it gave you some things to ponder, such as what sort of clothing is considered seductive? What is the body part that people want to show off that's considered like the most beautiful? And what sort of impractical clothing might a rich person wear, or a royal personage wear, to flex that like they don't have to do anything? What does the most powerful person wear? Are they a warrior? Are they a magic user? And what sort of things signify that this person holds power? What do the fashions of different characters say about their openness to changes in culture versus clinging to the past? These are just a couple of the questions that came up while I was drawing the clothes of my people, and I would absolutely love to know any ways that you have played with that in your fiction and your invented worlds. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this little journey into the fashions of my world and musings on fashion and world building. I would love to know if you have any interesting fashions in your fantasy worlds or sci-fi worlds, or how you've incorporated into historical, really anything. I mean, even a modern book can have fun fashion. And if you're interested in reading any of my fantasy books, the links are in the description, as well as links to my Substack and Patreon, which get the same content on both. And if you join the free tier, you'll get things like my book reviews and, you know, whatever else I feel like doing. And the $5 a month tier gets you access to my Discord, free monthly video, etc. I always love reading your comments and hearing from you, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye!